Joe, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Matt. It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's good to see you. It's so funny. For the audience, we originally met in Napa at the Blue Note Jazz Festival, and
That's right. Yeah.
Alan Evans. I came to see Al, and
Hmm.
he introduced me to you, and he was like, "Oh, you got to have him on your show." And I didn't know anything about you, and
Cool.
I mentioned your alter ego to people, Otis McDonald, and like without hesitation, numerous people were just like, "Oh my God, you know that guy?" I was like, "Well, I don't know him. I met him, and it's just hilarious." And then I started to dig, and I was like, "Oh wow, okay, you're doing all kinds of crazy cool shit. Yeah, we should."
Oh,
And then funny to run into you again at my favorite bar in Anaheim during NAM night after night.
oh yeah, man. That was really fun. We'll have to give a shout out to Case for dragging me over there. We happened to be on the same flight on our way down to Nam from San Francisco. And he was telling me about the hang because he had done it last year, and he was like, "Oh, you got to come." And I was like, "All right, well, just text me where to go at the end of the day."
Yeah.
And I'm boy, am I glad those were fun. And then ended up hanging out there and bringing my brothers over there too, and we had fun many a night.
Yeah. It's a good place to go. Of course the secret will get out and then everybody will go over there and next NAM. But anyway,
Yes,
it's a fun hang.
yeah, it really was.
Well, so let's jump in here. Where did you grow up?
So I'm from Rochester, New York, originally. I was born and raised there. Until I was just almost 20. I was 19, a couple of months shy of 20, and I packed up my bags. And when I say my bags, actually my drum set, I put all my clothes inside my drum set, packed it into the shells, and I had an opportunity to move out here to San Francisco because my oldest brother Adrian and his wife were living out here at that time over in Union Square, actually not too far from where I'm at right now in my studio. And I slept on their floor for about a month until I was able to find a job waiting on tables down in the financial district. And in that same week that I got a job, opening in a house of some close friends of theirs, my brother's and sister-in-law's college friends that happened to move out here from Michigan. That's where they went to college. They had a roommate moving out, and it was a great opportunity. It was a bedroom on the basement floor, and I had my own bathroom. And they said I could use the whole garage if I wanted to put my instruments in, and that's it, man. It started. That's when it all started out here, and that was 21 years ago. I'm still here.
So in Rochester, were you in school band at all?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. So my father was a music teacher, and he was a public school music teacher. And I started pretty young. However, our dad never pushed music on us. I mean, he was always playing lots of music around the house, and of course, we had tons of opportunities to see him perform because he was also a regular gigging musician on the weekends and in the evenings when he wasn't teaching. And we always had a little makeshift recording studio in the attic. Well, when we lived in the city of Rochester, our studio was in the attic, and then eventually, when I was in middle school, we moved out to the suburbs, and then the studio was in the basement.
Hmm.
But I have two older brothers. My oldest brother Adrian is 9 years older than me, and then my other brother Peter is 5 years older than me. And when my brother Peter was in high school or late middle school, he started being interested in playing the guitar. And I think maybe he was interested in it because that was the one instrument my dad didn't play. And so he was like, "All right, I'm going to play the guitar." And but my dad hooked him up with a great local jazz guitarist by the name of Steve Green, and he started studying with him. And simultaneously, my brother Adrian, who was away at college in Michigan, he also got interested in playing the guitar. So he started playing the guitar, and when he came home to visit, he was like, "Oh, Pete, you're in the guitar. I am too." And then me, I was 7 years old, and I just wanted to hang out with my brothers, and so I got interested in the bass. after seeing a local jazz band come to our school and give us an assembly, I came home one day. I was like, I want to play the upright bass. And my brother Adrian was like, nah, man, we play string instruments. You should play the drums. And not really thinking about that the drums was my dad's main instrument. But my brother walked me upstairs to the attic and showed me this, just a real basic rock groove, and I was hooked. I was in second grade, and that was it. My dad came home from teaching one day, and he heard me up in the attic playing his drums, which, by the way, happened to be the same exact drums that I still play to this day in my recording studio. People
Wow.
are always asking me how I get my drum sound. Part of it is I've been playing those drums since the very first moment I ever touched a drum. And that was it, man. I started when I was 7, and eventually when I was about 10, I was in 5th grade, and that was when school band was being introduced to us, and there was too many kids already playing percussion. And then that was around the time that Bill Clinton just became president, and I saw him on the Arsenio Hall show playing saxophone. I was like, well, maybe I'll play that. And then all the kids wanted to play saxophone too. And my pops, he was like, the trombone is a really cool instrument, and not a lot of kids want to play that. And he had a trombone that he could take home from his high school that he was teaching at, and so I started playing the trombone, and that was really where I started to learn how to read music and understand that language. And then that same year, I got really into Nirvana and Soundgarden and Stone Temple Pilots and all the stuff that was really happening at that time. That was when I was in 5th grade. So I asked my brother Peter if he could show me some things on the guitar, and he showed me how to play the bar chord like this. And once he showed me that, he was like, "Man, that's all those songs you like. You just got to learn how to play this one position up and down the neck." And then that was it. I was hooked. And the next year when I was in 6th grade, I started my first band, and we were just playing all those songs. And I was playing guitar in that band. But the whole time I was always playing the drum set because I was just always hooked on like funk rhythms and soul music, and basically anything that was informing Michael Jackson, because that was the first thing I really ever heard,
Oh
being
yeah.
a kid in the 80s, and hearing well, I was born the year that Thriller came out, or the year after Thriller came out. I was born in 83. But 87 is when Bad came out, and I remember my brother Peter coming home with that cassette tape, and that was the beginning of the end, so to speak, in terms of me being hooked on music and dancing. And then, of course, we were living in the hood in the 19th ward of Rochester. And so hip hop was really starting to blow up, and my brothers were all into hip hop music. So I was listening to that stuff too. But the first music that was like really my own uh, was the alternative rock, grunge scene that was happening in the early 90s. That's when what made me want to start my first band and start playing and doing all that.
It's a huge, huge emphasis on music and instruments growing up, and obviously that plays a major part of what your life is like today. When did you become aware of recording and recording technology or the production of records?
Well, like I said, my dad had he had a studio in the house, and we had this Fostex 8-track tape machine, a 1/4 inch tape machine. And I'd always see him playing around with it because he would score music for a local show that was on our PBS, which was called WXXI in Rochester. And this was like it was a show that one of his best friends produced. It was like a boating show. It was all about boats, but they needed a musician to score it. So my dad was always on his off time from teaching, he was writing all this original music, but using a lot of really like primitive MIDI instruments. He was using this thing called the Proteus, and he was using this drum machine actually that I have back here, this old Yamaha drum machine, and so he was always messing around with that. And then I would see him bring my brother Peter up there and have him sing and do stuff. But really, when I first started to understand the power of recording, it was 6th grade. It was that same year that I started my first band. Because at that point I was already playing the drums, and I was playing a bit of guitar, and then I could kind of get myself around the bass too. and I started just writing some songs, and I asked my dad if there was a way I could record it. Actually, let me back this up for a second. My first time ever really understanding the concept of recording was this little boom box that we had, and I would record music off of the radio on the boombox. But the for some reason, the way this boombox was set up, like the microphone would be active as well. So I'd be recording music off the radio, but the microphone be going, and you'd hear me like yelling at my mom in the kitchen, like or something like that, you know. And that was really the first time I ever understood that you could record yourself. So then fast forward to sixth grade, I asked my dad if I could record this song I was writing. He was like, "Sure, let me show you how it works." And so he brought me down to the basement, and he showed me this Fostix tape machine, which, by the way, I have that tape machine over here, and I still use it. It's a great deck. And so he showed me how to use the drum machine, and he was like, "Look, this is what you got to do. You got to program a drum beat, and then you can put down the guitar part, and then you'll put down the bass part." And I was like, "I don't understand." And he was like, "Well, this is called multi-tracking." And so he showed me after the drum machine part was down, then he showed me how to record myself playing the guitar. And he was like, "You get it?" I'm like, "Yeah, I get it." And he was like, "All right." And then you rewind the tape back, and he showed me how to reset, the 0 mark on the tape machine. And so I could go back to it at the same spot. Then I put the bass down. And he was like, "All right, now you can put the drums down." And so then I put the drums down, but my time was so shitty. I kept saying to him, I was like, "Something's wrong with the drum machine. It's the time's moving." And he started dying laughing. He's like, "No, man, that's not the drum machine. That's your drumming." so, so, but that was the first moment I thought, all right, well, with the next song, I'm going to play the drums first, and then I'm going to put everything else down just so I can move with my drumming. And and so that was really the beginning, working on my own original song. And and that was in sixth grade. And then in seventh grade is when the Beatles anthology, that documentary, came out on ABC. And of course, I'd already had been aware of the Beatles, but just a couple of their hits, and just digging through my dad's record collection and seeing that documentary. I mean, it was a family event. We would watch it. It aired over 3 nights, and we would tape it on our VCR. And and it was the second episode when you see them playing at Shea Stadium. I was like, that's the shit. I want to be like them. And then that became my obsession with the Beatles. And so that naturally led its way back to the recording deck, and really with me just trying to recreate some Beatles songs that I liked, and just playing my own versions of them. But at the same time, while I was learning these instruments, I had great resources like these Lennon and McCartney songbooks that had the little chord diagrams in it, so that could show me more chords on the guitar. And then when I felt like I had it there, then in singing always came really natural to me. I'd hit up my dad and be like, "All right, can I record this song?" "Sure, man." And then I remember he brought home a 4-track little cassette deck one time, and that was a lot easier to work, and I could just like plug in really, directly really quick to that. And those recordings weren't as cool as the ones that I would make on the Fostix, or they weren't as pristine, I should say. They were fine. They were fun. But yeah, I mean, I was obsessed with recording music and wanting to be a professional musician, basically from 11 years old on forward. I knew that's what I wanted to do, and it was really seeing the Beatles that made me want to do it. That was it.
I,
I want to do that stuff.
I'm just so it makes me smile just to hear you talk about such family support, just
Yeah,
your dad and your brothers musically just really stirring the pot there in the house
yeah.
and creating an environment to where that could all go down.
I was very, very fortunate to grow up in that environment. And I also I give credit to my mom and dad because they knew that we were all talented, but they wanted us to find it on our own. And my dad, being a music teacher, could have very well just been like, "All right, now it's time to learn an instrument." But he was the first in his family to kind of break away from the family business, being in sales or something else, or trying to be a doctor or something. He wanted to be a musician, and he was a gigging musician while he was in high school, and I pretty much followed suit. Because by the time I went to high school, at that point I was already playing a bunch of different instruments, and I'd taught myself the piano as well, um, mostly so I could learn how to play like Let It Be or Hey Jude or something. And I was lucky that we had all these instruments around the house. Um, and by the time I got into high school, or it was that summer before, my dad sat me down. He was like, "Look, it seems like you really want to do this thing. If you're going to get in high school, you got to get serious about one of them. What instrument are you the most serious about?" And I chose the drums. That was the first instrument. And he was like, "Well, great." He's like, "I'm not going to teach you the drums." And because we had already kind of tried that out, and it just wasn't a great dynamic. He's my dad as well, and he needs to be my dad.
Yeah.
But he set me up with a local drummer, who was like the guy in Rochester. He used to play drums for the Count Basie Orchestra. His name is Rich Thompson, and he also happened to be the drum set professor at the Eastman School of Music, which is a prestigious music school, and happens to be in Rochester. So I don't know if you know anything about Rochester, but it's kind of a breeding ground for a lot of great musicians. And being a drummer from Rochester, there's one drummer that is like, arguably the greatest, one of the greatest drummers of all time, and one of the most recorded drummers of all time, which is Steve Gadd. And I was lucky enough, because my dad was a drummer and studied with the same teacher that Steve Gadd studied with around the same time that Steve was studying with him, that I got to know Steve a little bit as well, because he still lived in Rochester and he raised his family in Rochester. And I remember my dad would sub for him sometimes, for if Steve was in town playing like a local like pit orchestra show or something, and then maybe he'd get a call to go out with Paul Simon or something, and then my dad would fill in or whatever. So that was really, how I got exposed to Steve Gadd, who is still to this day, my top favorite drummer.
Oh yeah.
Hard not to be, if you're a drummer growing up in Rochester, for that not to be your hero. Him and my dad are my heroes for drums. And yeah, that's so I got really serious about the drums in high school, and because I was studying with this great jazz drummer, it really started to inform my love for jazz and improvisational music. And then in high school I kind of became more of a jazz snob, I should
Yeah.
say. That's like all I was listening to.
Um,
But I always like the funkier stuff, is what I should say.
well, and
It's
that comes out a lot now in your Instagram post that I rabidly follow. T let's fast forward a little bit and move into San Francisco and talk about the progression of, you getting here, your waiting tables to where we're at now, because that's you told me a little bit about that story at the bar.
Mhm.
Um, tell me, and if you could recount a bit of that and talk about the progression of that, that moment entering San Francisco up to this point.
Sure. Yeah, so I moved here. Well, okay, so I was going to the Eastman School of Music. I eventually went there for college, and I did my freshman year there, studying drum set and jazz performance. But because I was really in love with recording, and I was really in love with a lot of funk music and R&B music that was happening at that time, like D'Angelo and Erykah Badu and Tribe Called Quest for hip hop, and that was starting to happen at the end of my high school career. And so I go into college being obsessed with this music, and my teacher is not really into it. It's beneath him. So my parents could see that I wasn't getting everything I wanted out of it. And it was about 2 weeks before my sophomore year of college. They sat me down, and they asked me, are you interested in taking a leave of absence and maybe checking out San Francisco? And the reason they chose this city is because my brother was here rather than me go to New York City where I didn't know anybody. And my dad did something similar when he was younger. he was just like, if the drum set is what you want to do, which I think in his mind, he was like, I'm not even sure if that's exactly what you want to do. But if that's what you want to do, you should go to a major city, pick up a phone book, which we still had back in 2003, and just try to start studying with drummers. And I was aware of the San Francisco scene because I was into people like Charlie Hunter and TJ Kirk and Scott Amendola, who was a drummer I kept reading on the liner notes. And when I moved here, I I saw Scott Amendola was playing down the street from where my brother lived at this jazz club, or it was a bar, or it was a restaurant. And so I went and saw him and I shook his hand and asked him if I could take a drum lesson. And he was like, sure, man, here's my number. And so I started doing the thing my dad told me to do. But all while I was trying to pursue drums and get better at that, because I wasn't old enough to go to a lot of clubs. I was only 20. Um, I started hearing about Pro Tools. And like I mentioned before, I was still working on tape machines at that point. And I knew about digital recording because my father was teaching music technology and he was showing Logic, but I had never really experimented with it. But I always heard about Pro Tools when I was in college because kids were like getting Pro Tools. They had these Power Books, is what the Mac Power Books, like the little silver ones. And because I got a job working full time, and I was making pretty good money for a 19-year-old at this restaurant in the financial district. So I I only had to pay my rent, and rent was actually pretty affordable back in 2003. I was like $500 a month in San Francisco, believe it or not. And so I I bought a laptop, and the M box had just come out, and so I bought an M box, and I started experimenting with this multi-track recording, and I really didn't know how to use it. I was just teaching myself how to use it. I didn't even understand the concept of plugins until maybe a year or two later. I was just going into the audio suite and printing everything anytime I wanted an effect. I didn't know anything about it, but I was making these pretty cool recordings. The drum set I could only record with two mics because I only had two inputs, and then I would plug the bass directly into it. And then my roommate had a Fender Rhodes, and so I was able to use that. And I would I got really into just hearing these new things that I was hearing in my head, like that I wasn't playing with at college. I was just trying to like write songs, which is really kind of a callback to what I was doing back in middle school, which I kind of left that behind in high school. And so I was kind of getting back into the stuff I had originally liked. And I had this Line 6 DL4. It's like a delay looping pedal.
Mhm.
And and that got really fun for me in terms of just coming up with songs. I would write a part and I would loop it so I could hear it over and over and come up with parts. And then I'd record the loop into Pro Tools and then on one track and then sing over it and on another track. And then eventually I kind of hit a point where I was like, I need to understand this program a little bit more. And I looked up a college course at SF State, and that was it was called Pro Tools 101. And I took this college course, and because I was already familiar with it, I could move a little bit faster than the rest of the students. But man, I remember when I learned about like tab to transient and being able to make loops in Pro Tools. I was like, holy smokes. And then I learned about plugins. I was like, oh, that's what those things are for, those little slots above the mixing faders. And so then I was on, and then my demos or whatever. I mean, I thought I was making a record, but they started getting a lot better. And I was also taking another class at SF State at that time, which was an introduction to independent recording labels and understanding how to distribute your music basically. And that teacher's name is John Bendick. And John, he really became a mentor to me. And I started showing him these recordings I was making, and he was pretty knocked out by it. He was like, "Wow, this is pretty cool." And he called me one day when I was getting out of my shift, and we had class that night. And he was like, "Look, um, before you come to class, you can show up late. I want you to go to this address." And this was over on Mission Street between Ninth and 10th. He's like, it's a studio. It's called Coast Recorders. There's a guy there. He has a lot of my students interning with him. His name's Ben Jonas. You should go there and meet this guy. And so I didn't even know who I was going to meet. And Ben didn't know who he was meeting. Ben thought he was meeting a potential intern. I didn't know who I was meeting. You know? And so I go over there and I meet him and I play him some songs and Ben's eyes open. He's like, "You're doing this on an M box?" And, yeah, man. He's like, "This is pretty cool." He was like, "You want a job?" Yeah, I was like, "Sure." And at the time, I actually happened to be looking for a new place to live. I just I had a girlfriend that lived in the East Bay, and I was kind of interested in maybe checking out the East Bay. And he lived in the Oakland Hills, and he was like, "Look, I have a studio in the basement with a Control 24. I didn't even know what that was, but you know, I have a Pro Tools HD. I knew what that was, and I didn't have HD. He's like, I'll tell you what, if you want to come work for me a few days a week, I need help around the office. Um, I'll help you produce your record." Okay, that sounds great. And he was like, and if you want, we're looking for a new roommate. And his other roommate at the time was this guitar player named Gowan Matthews, who's this phenomenal guitar player. And Gowan was just starting to kind of really get into learning production as well. And Ben afforded us the ability to be able to like really kind of hone in on our chops because we had this home studio. And then he had Coast Recorders as well. And so he was also teaching me how to work a studio. And he was teaching me a bit, but it was really a lot of the engineers there. This guy Sebastian Richard and this guy Chris Fletcher. They were the two engineers there, and I should say along all this ways, I did eventually have a fake ID, and I was like sneaking into clubs, and there was this thing happening every Tuesday night at Bruno's on 20th and Mission. It was called Jazz Mafia Tuesdays, and so I would show up. Actually, before I even had a fake ID, I would sneak in the back door when the musicians would be taking a smoke break. I'd go out and introduce myself, and I was never very shy. And I remember meeting Adam Thies, and he was like, "Hey, man, well, you know, why don't you come in and check it out?" And so I was obsessed with this collective of musicians. Every Tuesday was like there was like a hip hop group, and then there was like a 20-piece big band, and then like a brass band, and then like a string quartet. I'm like, this fucking guy is like doing all this crazy shit, and so while I'm working at Coast Recorders and getting coffee for musicians like Scott Amendola and John Evans, because you know Ben Jonas would be using them on all the records he was producing, and so I'm getting to hang out with these people and look over shoulders, and the Jazz Mafia guys are showing up, and I'm like, hey, you know, I've met you before, and then I eventually kind of worked up the courage to ask Adam Thies if he wanted to maybe like play bass with me on a gig because I started my own band at that time, and I should mention I was also playing with a band at that point that I had met on Craigslist. This band was called Reorchestra,
Mhm.
and it was like a jazz fusion group. And so I was playing playing drums with them, and eventually we started playing at Bruno's a little bit, and so I kind of got to know that scene a little more. And I had like a gig coming up that Ben had helped me book at Cafe du Nord, and my brother Adrian was playing guitar with me, but I needed a bass player for that gig, so I asked Adam if he wanted to play, and he did, and then that really kind of changed my whole trajectory because then he started inviting me out to go sing with Jazz Mafia, and that started like my whole kind of tenure with them, and then that eventually turned into this the apex for me was this thing called Brass Bows and Beats that I helped Adam write. I don't know if you're familiar with this project, but it was a 50-piece hip hop orchestra that we premiered at the Palace of Fine Arts in 2009.
Mm.
And do you know who Ben Jonas is?
Okay, so we have to pause for a sec because I have to fill in a couple or dump in a couple data points here. So Sebastian Richard
Yep.
was on WCA number 54. I mean, here we are nearing the 490 range.
Oh wow.
Actually, this is 490 that as I realize as we're recording. So Sebastian was on a long time ago. I've known Sebastian for a long time, and I guess I met him through Ben and Chris Fletcher. Guy, I haven't seen Chris in ages.
I was just texting with Chris yesterday.
You must tell him I say hello. But
I will. I absolutely will.
so Ben Jonas was running the studio there at Coast Mission 1340 Mission between Ninth and 10th. Ben would leave that studio. We don't have to go into the particulars of it, but Ben would leave.
Yeah, I know.
I would come in behind Ben and I took over the studio after Ben.
Oh man, when it was like Broken Radio,
Yeah.
that was your studio.
Yeah.
That is crazy.
There was a whole bunch of drama around my entrance into that, but and there was my own personal drama getting out of it, which led to this creation of this podcast. But
Oh
yeah,
wow.
that's the small world nature of everything you're saying.
What a trip.
And John Evans, of course, John is for the audience, John Evans is a bass player. He's probably one of the best musicians I feel I've ever met.
He's
Uh,
incredible.
he's a great person, great player. He plays with Tori Amos
Hmm.
quite a bit. That's like one of his main gigs, and he plays with a bunch of other people. But
Yeah, yeah. No, that was Tori was the main gig then. I think it still is now. And I got to go on and make some records with John as well, playing drums and him playing bass, for some artists that Ben was producing. And
a lot of connections there. I do know I don't know Ben well, but Ben and I had met in passing, and that's the common denominator there.
sure. Ben's whole thing was like he would produce, but he also would manage. And I was kind of oblivious to all of it. I didn't really understand the business. So that was kind of like my intro. I'm loyal to Ben in the sense that he really taught me how to use Pro Tools. He taught me how to operate it. And he was a hard guy to work for because he wanted to move fast, but that really kind of got my chops up, like the concept of key commands and like moving fast. And so I always credit him for that. But there was plenty of things I didn't like working with Ben. But we still remain friends to this day. And we both know the whole history of Coast. Luckily, that had nothing to do with me. So I was always friendly with Michael Romanowski and Paul Stubblebine as well. And
Michael
and
just texted me as we were talking a minute
oh,
ago.
that's hilarious. Please tell him I say hello. And um yeah, and so they eventually left Coast, but we still had the home studio. And so at that point I started dabbling with producing other artists, just because I wanted to get my chops up more. And I had a friend, this guy named Bob Wilms, whose alias was Bob America. And we made this pretty wild rock record. And Bob had some money, and I didn't really take much of the money, but I was like, if you can hire this bass player and this drummer, or I'm sorry, this bass player and this guitar player that are dear friends of mine from New York that I went to Eastman with. He was like, you fly them out, I'll put them up, because Ben was out of the country that summer, and so was Gowan. Gowan was always touring with somebody huge. So we had two rooms open in our house for the summer. I was like, they can stay with me. We'll make your record, Bob. And he's like, all right, sounds great. And so I had this wonderful summer with like my two best friends, this bass player, Mike Shivaro, and this guitar player, Gray McMurray. And we recorded this pretty wild rock record called Bob America, which unfortunately is not on any streaming service, but I've heard it recently and it still sounds pretty damn good. So that was my first time really producing. And then eventually I just called myself a producer. And then I started getting hired to produce, this young lady who was making an R&B record. I don't even know if she ever even put out a record, but I made the record. and and I was a gigging musician, and eventually through some of the musicians I was playing with, I got a great teaching gig and taught at what is now called CJC, but back in the day it was just the jazz school in Berkeley. But eventually, when it became an accredited bachelor degree program, Susan Moscarello, who ran the school at that time, she asked me to start the recording program. So I started teaching these musicians about Pro Tools, and they didn't have a studio or anything at the jazz school, so the kids had to have a laptop. And through, you know, the various producers and folks that I met, and then just kind of understanding my way around BitTorrent sites, I was able to like download stems of like famous tracks. And how I would teach that class is I would really teach the power of editing and being creative in your editing by giving them tracks from like Queen or the Beatles or the Police or Bob Marley, but I might give them like the drums from a Police record, and then the bass line from a Queen record, and then the vocals of Bob Marley, and then we would use our phones to record instruments in the school. And I'm like, all right, this is your final exam. You have to chop up all this audio and make something out of it. And because for 10 weeks, I would give them examples of how you could do this. I would show them live on the spot, and they would ask me questions. And yeah, so I was doing all that. And then I got around 2012, I had an opportunity that was, you know, I'd never had an opportunity like this in terms of performing, but I auditioned for the lead vocal and keyboard slash guitar position in the Mickey Hart band, Mickey from the Grateful Dead.
Yeah.
And I got that gig. And so then I was, you know, in the Grateful Dead world for 2 years, and went out on the road and was on the bus living with Mickey Hart and and all those musicians, and traveled around the country and around Canada and even across the world to Jerusalem. We played out there, and then that gig ended right at the end of 2013. And I'd saved up a bunch of money, and my now fiance, Justine, we got married at the end of 2013, had this beautiful wedding down in Sayulita, Mexico, and then we had no more money. It was all gone after that wedding, and I was kind of back at ground zero. And a thing happens, you know, when you go out on the road with a big artist like that locally, the musicians kind of forget about you, or they forget that you're even home. So I was home, and I was just trying to kind of get back into the gig scene. And that bass player that I mentioned that I had hired on that record I'd produced years before, that Mike Shivaro, who's in New York, Mike had just gotten a gig at YouTube, and he and another friend of his were in charge of creating this thing called the YouTube Audio Library, and which was a royalty-free music library. And I don't know how many people were on that team. That was in the New York offices for Google, but basically their job was to reach out to their music community and get people to provide tracks. And because YouTube was running into a lot of issues at the time, where, you know, people would use copyright music, and then that music or that video would get flagged and eventually taken down or demonetized. Or actually, I think it was, yeah, it was just around the time they started letting people monetize. So if you had like a Beyonce track in your video, it was like, boom, it's gone, or all the money is going to Beyonce's record label or whatever. So YouTube wanted to create their own audio library, and this small team was just reaching out to musicians they knew that could do that. And so Mike reached out to me, and he was like, "Do you want to try out?" Like, I had to first send them a folder of tracks I had done, so tracks on that record I had produced, and my own records. At that point I'd already put out 2 Joe Bagale albums,
Hmm.
which by the way are, you know, albums that I was playing all the instruments and singing, and stuff that harks all the way back to when I was on the M box. They had to approve it, and then they gave me a trial run. They were like, okay, you can try 10 tracks and we'll see how it does. And so I made 10 instrumental Joe Bagale tracks, and I just kind of treated it like it was my third album, but this will be an instrumental album. And I was being commissioned to do it, but the thing that was really um, the most appealing part to me is that they were going to give the full credit to the artist, not to YouTube. So if you go to this thing called the YouTube Audio Library and you find a track that you want, it would say the artist's name, and when you downloaded it, and it was in Final Cut or in your iTunes library or whatever, it would say who the artist was. And I started thinking like, whoa, well, YouTube is the biggest music streaming platform in the world. Even though it's not necessarily thought of that way. And
Right.
I'm talking about YouTube, like the website YouTube, not the YouTube Music or whatever it is now. At that time, there was like a billion users a week. I was like, well, it would be in my best interest to make my tracks as great as possible. Where I knew a lot of other musicians that were doing it were probably thinking, I'm just going to make some bullshit and get paid, you know? And
Yeah.
I was like, man, no, I'm going to make some tracks that are banging and hope that people start using my music. And so after the first 10 tracks did okay. There was this one video of this cute girl like smiling at a camera, and she opens her mouth and a spider crawls out of her mouth, and she used a song of mine, and that song was called Otis McDonald. And I called that song Otis McDonald because it was a tribute to Shuggy Otis and Michael McDonald. It's just a really quick name. And and then I had a YouTube channel at that time. Everybody did. You know, we didn't know what it was, but I had the Joe Bagale YouTube channel. So this song called Otis McDonald by Joe Bagale got used in this video that went viral like instantaneously. There was millions of views of this video. And then I just start seeing all these subscribers to my channel. And I'm like, holy shit, it's working. This is a thing. This is gonna work. And okay, so then YouTube comes back to me, and I think it was probably because of that video. And they're like, "Hey, we'd like you to make more music." Awesome, sounds great. I need a job, so and they're like, "We'll contract you to do 30 songs. Can you do 30 songs in 3 months, 10 tracks a month?" And I was like, "Sure." I've never done that before. It would take me years to make 10 tracks before, but sure, I'll do it. and and they said, but here's the catch. We don't have a lot of music in the hip hop library. Are you capable of making hip hop beats? Sure. Never done that before in my life. But yeah, let's go for it. I love hip hop music. And at that time, I was the biggest Jay Dilla fan and Dr. Dre and Madlib and Q-Tip. You know, I just loved all this stuff. But these are all cats that were making tracks where they were predominantly sampling like old soul and funk and jazz records. And this is a royalty-free library. I couldn't do that, nor had I ever done anything like that. I never played around with sampling. I never had an MPC or anything. But I had Reason and I had Pro Tools and I had Recycle. I was like, well, I'll just start making my own samples. And so I started every day. I would wake up, and some days I would hand my wife a Bob Dylan song lyric book. I'm like, hey, can you just flip through here and find a line that you like? And I'm just going to write something based off of that line, or maybe use that line. But the whole intention is that I'm just going to make like 30 seconds of music really quickly, multi-track, all the parts. I don't care if it's perfect. The point is I'm going to bring it into Recycle, chop it up, bring it into Reason, rewire it into Pro Tools so I can use my MIDI keyboard and just try to find different things within this sample. And I would speed it up or pitch it down. And then it was like the floodgates had opened. Like all of a sudden, I'm taking these little ideas that I have and I'm making it into these bigger ideas. And I'm not even thinking about it. I'm only reacting to it in the same way that I do when I'm on the drum set playing in a band or playing the bass, like improvising with people. This thing that I'd been working on my whole life was now informing an entire new way for me to write music because I wasn't thinking about it like I'm chopping up samples. It was I'm chopping this thing up, but I'm hearing this music that I created and I'm hearing a whole new sequence of it, and some of the like little white noise things that would happen would inform something that I would then take and play on an instrument. And before I knew it, I just started making all these tracks, and I was playing drums in, with my MIDI controller, because I had a home studio, but I couldn't get the best drum sound. So acoustic drums was really hard, and that's what I wanted to do. But I got really into this whole beat making and programming the drums and just doing my interpretation of all these hip hop artists that I really love. And it sounded so different to me, and I had this like crisis where I was like, well, I don't know if I should put this under Joe Bagale because it's so different than all this music.
Yeah.
Like there's millions of people that knew who Joe Bagale was. I mean, some people knew my music because of that video, but I don't even know why I really struggled with it. But it was my wife. She was like, remember that song you had, Otis McDonald? She was like, you should use that as a name. And I was like, oh, okay. And so I just started putting up all these tracks in the YouTube audio library under this name, Otis McDonald. I didn't have a website. I didn't have any social media under the name. I'm just going to make a YouTube channel for Otis McDonald. Let's see what happens. And then within 1 year, there were 3.5 million different videos on YouTube that had Otis McDonald tracks in it, with a total of 7.6 billion views of this music. And I just started seeing this YouTube channel that I would just put these songs up on, and I would use my cousin John, who's an artist in Detroit. He would make artwork, and I would just use his art. He was totally down with it. I just put the song with his artwork up on my channel, and just people would just be flocking over. If somebody used that song in their video and that video went viral, if I was lucky enough and then the video creator credited me in their description, people would click on that link, go to my channel, subscribe, watch the video. Views were going up, and I was like, wow, this is a thing.
So I have to ask, so you were commissioned to do these tracks.
Correct.
So were you also getting paid based on
Royalties?
yeah.
No, no, it's
Okay.
royalty free.
Right. Right. Right.
Meaning, yeah, meaning the only people that collect royalties on those are the video creators. So I collect royalties on my channel. Anytime somebody would come over and click, eventually those numbers started going up and the subscribers started going up. So I was able to monetize. It's not very much, because my channel's not gigantic. I mean, now it's a little over 100,000 subscribers, but it's back then, I was maybe at like 20,000, but it went from 0 to 20,000. Like, this artist never existed. So this was an exclusive type of distribution that really had not been done before. And and it was just kind of blowing my mind. And so I was like, all right, well, there are so many more people that know the name Otis McDonald now than Joe Bagale. I'm just gonna start putting out music under his name, Otis McDonald. And eventually the subscribers kept going up, and anytime I would put up a video of me, like maybe mess around making a track, that would do pretty good. Comments would go, and then I eventually put together a band that I would call Otis McDonald. And I remember the first video I put up of us playing, and these are all my guys from like Jazz Mafia and this band Atticid that I play with. And I put up a video, a multicam video of us playing a song I wrote, and that video did so well. And all these YouTubers are commenting. They're like, "Oh my God, this dude is like, he plays instruments." They just thought, they were like, "We thought you were a DJ." Or no, no, I like played the thing. And it just, it started doing good. And then around 2018, Facebook started a very similar thing called the Facebook Sound Collection. And I think they basically just kind of started poaching, or not necessarily. It's not like I had an exclusive deal with YouTube or anything, but they hit me up and asked if I wanted to contribute to their collection. Sure. Yeah, that sounds great. More Otis McDonald music. And it's nice to have like a contract that induces creativity and that holds me accountable to make something.
Did they just reach out cold to you, Facebook?
Yeah, I mean, there were some people, I believe, that left YouTube, and they went over to Facebook, so I was on their radar. Um, but it was a similar process. It wasn't like I just got the gig. I had to go meet with folks and send them my music and see how it was doing. And
I don't know if I'm recalling the story correctly. Did you tell me in Anaheim at the bar, did you tell me that you were able to, like, with the Facebook thing, it was very similar to the YouTube arrangement, but didn't you hold on to the rights to the songs for Facebook in some capacity, or did I make that up?
no, 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 no. I don't. They technically own all the music that I give to them,
Mhm.
but Facebook has actually been really, really wonderful and supportive of the musicians that are contributing to that, where they essentially license it to us in perpetuity, where we're allowed to release it on DSPs and so Spotify and
Okay, yeah, that I
yeah.
think that's where I was going with that, is that they take the music and it gets used, but then you can release it on the streaming
I
platforms
can release it on the streaming platform. And
and take the money from the streaming.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's such like small potatoes
All
for a
50
company.
cents of it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, okay, so let's talk about that actually, because in 2020, the pandemic happens, everything is shut down. That gig's not happening. But here I am with all this music that I've put out on YouTube and Facebook. And I'm like, well, I know that it was technically paused, the gig it was, but I know that there's an expiration date on this. It's not going to last forever. So how can I figure out a way to make money off of this music? And so at that point, I had made a little over 100 tracks for Facebook, now Meta. And I decided, well, if I look at this like a track that I can put out every single week, that's 2 years worth of music. That gives me 2 years to make 2 more years worth of music. And luckily, I don't really know how this timing worked out, but I started dabbling with setting up a multi-camera setup here in my studio, which we have to talk about the story of me getting the studio too. Well, we'll get there. Um, I'd say because YouTube was still my more popular fan base. So on Friday, March 13th, I think it was 2020, like 2 days before lockdown happened, I did. I had been for 2 months. I had been working on this live stream thing to see if I can get it to work. And then I went live, my very first live stream where I made something live on YouTube using, good audio, good cameras. And why I went live that night is because they were on lockdown in Siena, Italy, and there was this video of people singing out their windows to each other.
Mhm.
And I was so moved by it. I I told my wife to bring our son over. I was like, I'm gonna make something, we're gonna do it live. And so I sampled that and I made this track. And then 2 days later we were locked down, and people loved that track. And then I eventually put out that track as a part of this this charitable organization that I ended up helping create with this crew that I have called Track Tribe, which that guy Mike Shivaro I mentioned earlier, he's a part of it. Um, and and Track Tribe was kind of really founded around this concept of music being in these audio libraries, and so we all kind of came together and were like we can make our own thing doing this. And but when we were on lockdown and not doing anything, we were like, all right, let's make this cool charitable music streaming um, playlist. And we started reaching out to bigger artists to contribute songs, and where 100% of the royalties went to an organization we teamed up with called Why Hunger. And Why Hunger was providing, all this food for food banks for people that were less fortunate during the pandemic. But then we started getting big artists on there, like Wilco gave us something, Tom Morello gave us something, and the list just kind of keeps going on. And it was just really cool. And so I took this song that I made and I called it While Sienna Sings, and put it out on there. Um, and and that was just so fun to make music that fast, to make it in front of my YouTube audience, and they could be a part of it, and then they're a part of it when it's being released too, because they're like, I was there, I saw it. So going back to releasing a song every week, I was like, all right, I'm going to put out these songs every week and see if I can get my streaming royalties up and get my streaming numbers up. All the while, I'm going to start going to the studio every Friday. I'm going to stream live and make a new track, because this holds me accountable now to make something new. And sure enough, now we are 4 years past that, and I've been putting out a song every single week since October 2020. And now all the songs that are coming out are songs that I made on those live streams. And because I have video that accompanies all of it, I'm then able to go in and chop up the video and make it into like a YouTube short or an Instagram reel or a TikTok or whatever. And it's just, I look at it as just marketing, for the song release. And then the rest of the marketing comes from all the people that use my music in their videos. Um, yeah,
Can you
it's
tell me a bit about how so you're at Hyde Street Studios, and, for those who are just tuning in for this, on the podcast, who've never been here before, Hyde Street Studios is a classic studio that's been around for a very, very long time. You can listen to maybe some of my interviews with Dan Alexander or maybe even John Cunaberti. There's a lot of old Bay Area pros that will talk about it. So you're at Hyde Street, but how did you come into possession of what studio are you in?
I'm in Studio D.
Okay. How did you come into possession of that?
Man, well, this was like a major full circle moment for me. And I had mentioned that my brother was living here, and that was a big incentive for me to move to San Francisco. But since I was in middle school, I was pretty obsessed with a lot of music that was coming out of the San Francisco Bay Area, particularly Herbie Hancock and all his funk records in the 70s. I loved Headhunters and Thrust and I heard that at a very early age. And then eventually I got into Tower Power and Sly Stone, and I just started noticing like, man, everybody plays funk music really differently from this one area, this kind of linear approach. So when I moved here, I was obsessed with Herbie Hancock. I was like, I got to figure out how to make music like that. And my brother took me to Amoeba Records, and I could get these like bootlegs of Herbie or these imports, these live records. And so I was like, man, I want to play music like that. And this is the place to do it. So then 2019, this is a few months after my wife and I have our first child. And I'm at this point, the Otis McDonald thing has been going on for about 4 years. I'm doing all right, making steady income. We have a kid. We have a 2-bedroom apartment. Our son is eventually going to need this room. I need a studio. I think I'm ready to move the studio out of the house. So I was gonna try to do a studio at like Secret Studios, one of those rehearsal spaces, and just kind of deal with the noise or go in after hours or whatever, just try something. And I was doing a session at Different Fur. I was recording a string section on a album I was working on, and the engineer I hired was a buddy, Alberto Hernandez. Do you know Alberto?
Yeah,
So
Alberto's been on the show. Yeah.
beautiful. So Alberto and I got to know each other on this project that I directed. It was the 50th anniversary to Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. That was done by this organization called Undercover Presents, and so I was the musical director and kind of producer of that album. And Alberto and I became buddies through that process. And Fantasy had just closed, and I had actually acquired some of the gear from there. Or well, if from his name, who was the technician at Fantasy?
Not sure. Not an
And he
engineer, but a technician.
he was the tech. He was the house tech there. So Fantasy had all their own gear, but they had a lot of. You remember it was modular in the sense that you can move gear and racks to different studios, and
Yeah.
so a lot of that stuff was basically on permanent loan from the house tech. Like he had racked that stuff, but that was his own collection. And when Fantasy closed, he retired. He sold his gear, and I got some of it. And one of it was his rack of 4 Neve 1073s that had the original cards that he pulled out of the console. And another one was their D20 kick mic, which was the only D20 at Fantasy, but it was his, and I got it. So it had a pedigree. This gear had all this history, and I'm hanging with Alberto, and we're doing the session. I'm talking about the gear that I got from Fantasy. He was like, "Oh, that's awesome." He was like, "I recorded with those Neves so many times," and I asked him, I was like, "Man, I'm trying to find a studio, and we're setting up the mics for the session." And he was like, there's a room that's over at Hyde Street Studios, and it's a really classic room. He's like, all those Herbie records here into that's where it was made. And I'm like, are you serious? He's like, yeah. I was like, why don't you take it? He's like, I looked at it with my partner, and he's like, but the neighborhood, is kind of rough and not the best place to bring clients. He's like, but for you're a one-man band, and you're not even bringing in bands. You're doing your own thing. He's like, it might be perfect. And then by the end of that session, he remembers. He's like, actually, now that I remember, I think it might have gotten leased. And I'm like, oh, okay. I'm like excited throughout the session, and then I'm like a little heartbroken. I'm like, okay, all right, well, it wasn't meant to be. And and so my wife and I take our son back to Rochester. We're introducing him to my family over there, and he's only 2 months old. And he's taking a nap. I'm sitting in my parents' living room. I hop on the computer. I go on Craigslist. I go to, rentals. I just type in recording studio just to see if I can find it. Sometimes like a commercial space will come up, perfect for a studio or whatever. And at the top of the list is this fucking room, Hyde Street Studio, Studio D. And there's a picture. I'm like, that's that space. And I like send it to Alberto. I'm like, is this that space? He's like, yeah. He's like, I guess it is still for rent. And I get on the phone and and Jack, the studio manager, he picks up. I'm like, hey man, my name's Joe Bagale. I live in San Francisco, but I'm in Rochester, New York right now, but I'm gonna be home in like 4 days. Is that space available? I'd like to come take a look. He's like, yeah, it's available. He's like, there's somebody else looking at it too. But I'm happy to hold it off if you want to come check it out. So as soon as we get home, we put our son in the car seat. We drive over here. We have him in the stroller. We tour the place. I had never been here before. I only knew about it. I obviously knew about Wally Heider Studios because so much of my record collection had Wally Heider Studio stamped on the back of it. And and so we're walking around and he shows me Studio A, which is great. I wasn't super knocked out by it. I could hear like some reflections and stuff. But then we walk upstairs to Studio D, and I'm like, oh yeah, no, this is a vibe. This feels like a Bill Putnam room. And then he tells me the history of this room, and then he's like, oh hey, you said you were in the Mickey Hart band, right? I was like, yeah. He's like, oh, funny story, and I already knew this story because I had heard this from Mickey Hart. But he tells me this story. He's like, yeah, Mickey got tired of coming in at night and the engineer wiping the board during the day and them having to rebuild it. So he like hired a bodyguard with a samurai sword to stand up front. And I'm like, oh yeah, I know this story really well. Actually, Mickey told me this story because Mickey was crazy. And by the time we leave and go home, I had an email from Jack and he's like, look, we want you to have this studio. You would be a much better candidate than the other people looking at it. Which after I moved in, I come to find out from some of the other people in the studio that it was like an adult film company that was maybe going to rent the room. So it
Oh,
wouldn't even have been a music studio. It would, I mean, who knows? You might be seeing people like in robes walking out the door or some shit. But it is soundproof, so 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 yeah, it was a done deal. My wife was like, you should do it. This seems like the right move. And uh and I mentioned that thing how it felt like a Bill Putnam room. I come to find out after being in here that Wally Heider, because I'm just like a history guy. Like I want to read everything about it, understand all of it. I come to find out that, Wally Heider was a protege of Bill Putnam and worked heavily at what was Western. Now it's East West Studios, but he worked in Studio 3 a lot, which was the room where Pet Sounds was made and the Mamas and the Papas did like California Dreaming. And Wally Heider was engineering a lot of that stuff. And so when he moved up here to create Wally Heider Studios, Studio D was a clone of Studio 3. Yeah, that was the last session he did in Studio 3. He took an architect in there, measured all the dimensions, and recreated that same exact room in Studio D. And now that's my room.
and so you've
Eh,
had that since what, 2019 or 2020?
2019, April 2019. I just passed my 5 year mark. This is my fifth anniversary this month. So
Wow, wow, congrats. That's a good sign. It's that it's all working out.
it's working out. And back to the releasing music regularly, I've been able to get my Spotify royalties um, every month. It pays the rent of the studio.
Holy
And
shit.
yeah. And so, I'm not making like rock star money, but I make enough money to pay my rent and a little bit of my rent at home. And then I supplement the rest of my income with, yeah, I'd still do a little bit of work with Meta. It's not like it was, before the pandemic or anything,
Right.
but really I've gotten into producing records and I met you through Alan Evans, which by the way, I was a giant fan of Soul Live when I was in high school, getting in because of jazz and funk music. Um, One of the last hangs I had at the studio before lockdown, my good buddy Will Blades, wonderful Hammond organ player that I play regularly with, Will brought over Adam Deitch from Lettuce, the drummer, and I was a huge Adam Deitch fan because I was a giant John Scofield fan. And of course, I knew Lettuce, and because of the crossover with the Soul Live guys, I was a big Eric Krasno fan. And Will brings Deitch over. This is the night before New Year's Eve in 2019, and I'm playing Deitch the tracks I'm making in this room, and he's like freaking out. He's like, "Man, these productions like sound amazing. How are you getting those drums?" And he's like, "You need to know Eric Krasno." And so he calls Kraz like the next day and tells him, and then I see Kraz following me on Instagram. And then when the pandemic happened, remember that charitable thing I was telling you about?
Yeah.
I reached out to Kraz. I was like, "Hey, would you want to contribute a song to this?" And he's like, "Sure." He's like, "I don't really have anything new. Do you want to make something together?" And so he had this Bob Dylan tune he wanted to cover, that song "The Man in Me," that was, popular from the Big Lebowski film. And I was like, "Oh, I love that song. Let's do it." And so he sent me a little demo of him singing and playing acoustic guitar, or no, playing electric guitar. And after my live stream one of those nights, I uh, I recorded myself playing drums and bass and organ and piano on that demo he sent me, and I sent it back to him. And he freaked out. He was like, "This is incredible." He's like, "You want to produce my next record?" Sure. And so here I am working with one of my heroes, and I started it, and that's how I really spent the whole pandemic, doing live streams and producing Kraz's record. And then eventually my buddy Mike Shivaro, the guy I was telling you about, that bass player that I went to Eastman with, and we made that first record I produced, and then he eventually got me the gig at YouTube. Mike and I were talking one day, and he starts sending me these tracks of him playing bass, just bass. And at that time we started messing around with this thing called pedal, which these guys out in the Netherlands had made, and it's basically like Zoom but like on steroids for audio, and it looks like a guitar pedal on both people's computers, where you could record audio into it and drag it and drop it into your DAW of your choice. And so Mike and I would get on in the morning, and he would play these bass lines, drop it in the pedal. I'd bring it into Ableton, and I was using my phone as the camera, but he was hearing the audio from my studio, so I would just bring my phone over by the drum set. I'd play some drums to it, and we are like, "Yeah, this is pretty cool." And I was like, "Hey, man, I have a session this afternoon, as session, online session with Eric Krasno. I'm gonna just show him this stuff. Maybe he wants to throw some guitars on it." So Kraz puts his guitars on it, and then at the end of the weekend, we had like two songs that I had edited up and mixed, and we're like, "Man, this is pretty cool." And Kraz is like, "Yeah, we should put this out." And so we created a whole band called King Canyon, and that was our trio: and Mike Shibaro and Eric Krasno and I, and eventually just doing those kinds of sessions remotely like that. Mike in New York, Kraz in LA, and me up here. We made this album so fast, not once playing in the same studio together. And then because of Kraz's connection to the whole world of music, he started getting his buddies involved and brought Derek Trucks on a track, and then this guy Son Little, and meanwhile, me and Mike are texting each other like, "Holy shit, dude! Like Derek Trucks is playing on our record," because Mike and I would go see Soul Live and Derek Trucks and all these guys together when we were in college, and so it was
Well,
just a
amazing.
trip.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
So I have to say, and Joe, don't take this the wrong way, but I have remained probably more quiet than I have in most interviews because unprompted, you've taken us through the journey. I really appreciate that.
Oh, right on.
Sometimes you get a guest that you gotta really kind of, you know, milk it out of them a bit, but you've really taken us through this journey of that you've had. It's remarkable on so many levels. And
Oh man.
and it's the reason I find it remarkable is because you've just focused on the music at the end of the day, and somehow the opportunities just kind of fall into place at the right time, it seems, and that's pretty cool. And a lot of people I have on here are just they're straight up audio engineers.
Mm-hmm.
You have the whole package, well-versed musician, producer, engineer. You have such enviable talents to complete music and make cool records, and I love what you're doing. It's
Thank
just
you.
really, really remarkable. So I just
Thank
wanted
you,
to
man.
say that not to blow smoke up your ass, but sincerely, I think it's really remarkable. And I wish there were more people out there like you that just you're so adventurous too with technology and like, doing the whole multi-camera thing during the pandemic and really, really fun to talk with you about this. But I have a couple questions before we wrap up, and that is, you mentioned your wife and your kid. You have one kid now, or do you have two
We
now?
have two now.
Okay,
We had a pandemic baby as well.
not a pandemic baby. Okay,
Yeah, yeah, we have two boys.
how do you make this work with the work-life balance and the family and keeping everybody happy?
That's a great question. So I knew when I was going to put our family in a financially risky moment by taking on another property to rent, um, that they depended on me to succeed at doing this thing. And it was always funny to me being a musician or just being an artist in general, especially if you're like a gigging musician. Nobody holds you accountable to clock in to work, right? And that's not a liberty that most people have. Most working class people got to be there. They got to clock in, they clock out. And musicians, we would stay out all night after the gig, after playing for like 2 hours, and then you stay out all night drinking and hang with your friends, and then you sleep in and do whatever you want and go to the next gig. So you're not really working that much, And so it occurred to me that, well, if I'm going to take this studio on, I'm going to go to work every day like everybody else goes to work. So I show up here at 9 in the morning and I work till 5 in the evening. And then I go home and make dinner with the family and get the kids to sleep and go to bed at a reasonable hour. My wife and I, always stay up after the kids and we get to check in and make sure everything's good. And eventually we get to go out on dates and do that stuff. I don't gig as much as I used to. Of course, after Kras's record finished, we did tour that and I went out on the road with them. And that was cool, but it was nice to be back out on the road. I hadn't done it in a while, but it was also a nice experiment to see, how does it work being away from the family? And it sucks. It's not. I don't like it. I love performing. Don't get me wrong. That is something that I would like to start doing more of now that my kids are getting a little older. Um, but I mean, really, ever since seeing that Beatles anthology thing in that moment where they decided to stop playing live because they couldn't get better, and they were like, "Well, we're just going to focus on writing and recording music." That is had always been the thing in the back of my mind. I just want to figure out how to make a living being me and being in the studio and just making the music that I want to make. And because I know that it's the record industry is not what it once was, but I mean, it only takes a little bit of Googling to figure out that, well, actually the industry is making as much money, if not more, because of streaming platforms. So maybe this thing is actually built for independent artists if you can handle doing all the things that a label would have to do for you. And so it's a lot of work. And in fact, I wish I spent more time making music. This control room that I'm in is my office as well. And I spend a lot of time um posting stuff on social media, editing things, and now I have people helping me edit videos as well. But all the administrative stuff, like uploading all my music to my distributor, which I use DistroKid, pitching a song every single week for editorial playlist, which you actually have to write a pitch, for an editor. It's a whole process and fill out metadata. And I do all of that. It's a schedule. Yeah, just treating it like a 9 to 5 job, man.
And
And
it's like the new music industry in one respect, the way you're operating as
oh,
a
for sure.
as a producer, as an artist, as an engineer, as a record company, as a promotion company.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, well, in regards to the all like the engineering side of it and learning to record, learning to mix and master. I mean, that is something that a lot of musicians are kind of hands off about. And I used to rent this studio for 4 years every Sunday. It's called Bird and Egg Recording Studios. Do you know
Yeah,
that?
yeah, Nino's a friend and he's been on the show.
Oh, he has. Great. Nino, oh, man, I mean, I could talk for hours as you can probably tell. When I was making my first record in 2007, somebody showed me Nino Moschella's first album. You know, Nino's a drummer and a multi-instrumentalist like me. I remember I just stopped making my record for a while after hearing it. I was like, this guy is incredible. And then Nino and I eventually became really close friends. And then when he moved back to the Bay from Fresno and then opened up Bird and Egg, I had the opportunity to rent his space. And that's where I really learned how to understand a studio and a patch bay and everything, just because he gave me the keys and let me experiment there. And I rented that with this other musician, Matt Berkeley, who I used to work with regularly in Jazz Mafia. And then his band was that band Reorchestra that I met on Craigslist and played with. Matt and I, unfortunately, we had a bit of a falling out years ago. We're still friendly with each other. However, there was this moment where we were mixing an album of mine, and actually Chris Fletcher was helping with the mix, and just something wasn't quite right, and I didn't know how to articulate it. And I was like, wow, let me just try mixing this thing. And Matt was like, man, you don't have to do it all. That's what he said to me. He was like, just let the professionals do it. And I was just like, well, yeah, man, but I want to know how to do it. Like, don't you get it? Like, I want to understand how this things work. And I gotta say that most musicians should know how to do it. Not just the recording part. Plugging a microphone into an interface and getting signal is about the easiest thing you can do with these programs. Choosing the right microphone, placing it the right way, understanding a room, like that is a whole other level. And that comes with the territory. The moment you do it and you start hearing ugly reflections, it starts to inform that decision. But in regards to mixing and then eventually mastering, I feel like it has every bit as much to do with your artistic output as it as you just playing your instrument and writing a song. Like it's your sound, and what you want to do as an artist is find your sound, and that's the journey that I feel like I've been on since the very beginning. It's just trying to figure out how it sounds in my head. I think the thing that is most striking to most people about my production work and I feel like has led to the different records that I've been producing is because of the drum sound that I get. And I talk about, well, I've been playing those drums since I was 7,
Yeah.
but my approach to recording and mixing the drums is always been about how does it sound when I'm sitting behind the drums. That is the sound I've been trying to put into the speakers. And I remember trying out, doing stuff like putting 14 microphones on the drums at one point, just trying all these different experiments. And then I was reading a book, or I was reading an interview with one of my favorite producers, Phil Ramone, because I'm a huge Billy Joel and Paul Simon fan. And I remember him saying something like, well, if it sounds good to the drummer, let's start by just going and putting 2 microphones where his ears are. And I was like, holy shit, that just like totally blew my mind. It's so simple. It's so right on the money. So that's where I started. And then I would just eventually just kind of move the drums. And of course, I'm a nerd. I would be reading about Glyn Johns and the Glyn Johns method. And so eventually it just kind of became a hybrid of these different things, but it all revolved around the center, which a lot of people say the snare drum is the center, but the center is really the person on the drum throne. And that is where that's to me is what should inform all the things. And then mixing became a lot easier after that. That's what I started to realize. And granted, I am really lucky to have an extraordinarily great sounding room that they don't make many rooms like this anymore. And
A classic
it's
space.
it's a classic space, and so many records that have informed the musician that I am were made in this space. And I believe heavily in the ghosts of those records being in the walls. And to me, anytime somebody like a musician passes away, somebody's like, well, should we pay tribute to that musician tonight? And Sure, we could, but isn't what we do as musicians, we pay tribute to all of our heroes in everything that we do. Every note that we play is for those people that we love and admire. Every recording that I make is in tribute to the records that were made in this space, and and the records that have informed me in my childhood, you know. So that's, to me,
Well,
that's what it's all about. And so as much time as I can spend in here as possible is what I'm gonna do.
let me ask you a non-fun question, and it's a
Sure.
very working class audio question. You've really kind of uh, been in all aspects of music. I mean, you've performed live, you've made records, you've done music for corporate entities, um, you've produced, and you've figured out how to make a living doing this, and you've kind of structured your world to where it supports your family, which I really love. Do you have a financial philosophy about how to maintain what you've got? And what are there disciplines that you employ for yourself in regards to money?
My school of thought there is that money is just a tool. Um, so you need money to, obviously, to pay for the things that matter the most, like food, diapers, a roof, water, like, you know, all the basics. Then the rest, and then the other part of the money should go back in, if you have some, should go back into reinvesting into the thing that is making you the money. So to me, that's reinvesting in my career as a musician. So gear, you know, like I'm not going to sit and buy the hottest, newest piece of gear if it's not going to contribute to this thing that is helping my family. And do I really want the newest thing, or do I want the things that are classic and tried and true that I know is going to appreciate and value? And that's kind of more the world that I think about. It's, well, and also because I'm just a gear nerd and a, you know, in a Beatles head. Like, I buy all the microphones that they use. If it was good enough for them, that is, I'm going to figure out how to use it because I want it. But I also know that, eventually my kids, they might not be in the same business as me, and I'm not going to need all this shit at some point. But maybe they're going to need to buy a car or a house or something. And maybe those Neves in 10 years are going to be worth a lot more. I'm pretty sure they probably will be. And so it's better to invest in the things that have appreciation built into it. And so if I make enough money to pay for my family and then invest it back into my work being better and getting better and being, working smarter, then that's great. That's all I really want. If there's more money after that, it's nice to go on a vacation once in a while, but really I feel like it should go back to people that need money. It's so, um, I'm not here trying to drive a fancy car or anything. I mean, shit, I drive a 1999 Chevy Prism to the studio every day. It's
Wow, and I thought my car was old. Wow.
yeah.
Yeah.
My 99 Chevy Prism only has 61,000 miles on it. And it looks like a piece of shit. The paint job's all rusted out and everything, but I don't care. It's all dented up. I
It,
don't need. I'd rather be underestimated anyway. Yeah,
it,
that's why I like the opening slot when I'm a performer. Like, let me open.
it gets you from A to B. Okay, well,
Amen.
for the audience, the website to check out is otismacmusic.com. Obviously, I'm going to include that in the show notes, as well as some of the people that we've mentioned, Alberto Hernandez, Sebastian Richard, Nina Michella. Their episodes will all be in there. They've all been on the show. So it's
Beautiful.
great to chat with you at length and hear your story, which I think is very inspiring to a lot of people. Talk about being underestimated. If you ever underestimate yourself in that department, I think you'd be wrong, because I think your story in particular inspires not just musicians but producers and engineers and all of us in the music industry. I think it's very fascinating.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. And thanks for having me on, man. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. All right. You take care.
You take care of yourself.